The rain fell like whispers against the glass towers of the city, soft and persistent, as if the heavens themselves were trying to tell a secret that no one was listening to. Inside the penthouse office on the 47th floor, where the lights of the metropolis stretched out like a blanket of stars fallen to earth, she stood alone with her thoughts and the weight of a truth she had only just discovered. Her name was Amara Osei, and she was a woman who had built an empire from nothing, a billionaire whose face graced magazine covers and whose name commanded respect in boardrooms across the continent. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, she was simply a woman whose world had been turned upside down by a man she thought she knew. A man who had walked into her life 3 months ago, wearing humble clothes and speaking quiet words. A man she had hired to protect her body, without realizing he would eventually capture her heart. The city below pulsed with life, millions of souls moving through their evening routines, unaware that high above them, a story was unfolding that would challenge everything Amara believed about trust, destiny, and the invisible threads that connect two people across the vast distance between different worlds. Behind her, standing in the shadows where he always positioned himself, was Kofi. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his presence filling the room without effort, without noise, without the need for words or gestures or any of the performative displays that lesser men used to announce their importance. For 3 months, he had been her shadow, her silent guardian, the man who stood 2 steps behind her in every meeting, every gala, every moment when the world demanded her attention, and she had to perform the role of the untouchable billionaire. She had hired him on a whim, or what she thought was a whim, after her head of security insisted she needed personal protection following a series of anonymous threats that had grown increasingly specific and disturbing. Kofi had arrived with no resume, no references, no polished presentation. Just a simple introduction from a friend of a friend, a man who said he needed work and could keep her safe. She remembered the day he walked into her office, wearing faded jeans and a shirt that had seen better days, his eyes calm and steady as they met hers without fear or calculation. There was something about him that didn't fit, something that made her pause, even as logic told her to send him away and find someone with proper credentials and a background she could verify. But she had hired him anyway, against her better judgment, against the advice of her assistant Thandiwe, who raised her perfectly sculpted eyebrows and whispered later that Amara must be losing her mind to bring in someone who looked like he had just walked out of a village. And for weeks, Kofi had been exactly what she expected. Quiet, efficient, invisible. He stood outside her office during meetings, drove her car when needed, checked every room before she entered, and never spoke unless she spoke to him first. The other staff barely noticed him. He was furniture to them, background noise, just another employee in an organization that employed thousands. But Amara noticed him. She couldn't help it. There was something in the way he moved, like water flowing over stones, smooth and purposeful and impossibly graceful for a man of his size. There was something in the way his eyes scanned every space, reading the room, calculating distances and exits and potential threats in the span of a heartbeat. And there was something in the way people unconsciously stepped aside when he walked past, as if some primal part of their brain recognized danger even when their conscious mind saw only a quiet man in a simple suit. The first time she truly understood that Kofi was not what he seemed was at a gala 3 weeks after she hired him, one of those glittering events where Africa's wealthiest gathered to network and compete and measure themselves against each other in subtle and not so subtle ways. She had worn a golden gown that shimmered like sunlight captured in silk, her hair braided into an elaborate crown that took 2 hours to create, her makeup flawless, her jewelry worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. She was a vision of success, of power, of everything she had fought to become. Kofi had followed 2 steps behind, in a black suit that somehow made him look both invisible and impossible to ignore. Thandiwe had laughed when she saw him preparing to accompany Amara, asking in that cutting way of hers whether Amara was really bringing him to an event where these people would eat him alive. But Amara had defended her choice, even though privately she understood the concern. This world was brutal in its own elegant way. People judged you by your shoes, your watch, your accent, the way you held your wine glass. Kofi didn't belong in that world. At least, that's what she thought, until they walked through the doors, and every eye in the ballroom turned to look not at her, but at him. It was subtle at first, the way the room reacted to Kofi's presence. A pause in conversations, a turning of heads, women whispering to each other behind champagne flutes, men studying him with narrowed eyes, trying to place him, trying to understand why this man who dressed simply and spoke rarely commanded attention without seeking it. Amara felt it too, that strange pull of charisma that had nothing to do with wealth or status or any of the usual markers of power. It was something deeper, something primal, something that made her heart beat faster, even though she couldn't explain why. Her rival, Kwame Addo, had approached them within minutes, his smile sharp and predatory, his expensive cologne announcing his arrival before his words did. Kwame owned a competing tech firm and had spent years trying to destroy Amara's reputation, spreading rumors about her business practices, questioning her competence, suggesting that a woman from her background could never truly understand the complexities of running a major corporation. He greeted Amara with false warmth before turning his attention to Kofi, his tone dripping with condescension as he asked who this assistant was and whether Amara was now hiring help off the street. Kofi had said nothing at first, his face expressionless, his body still. But when Kwame pressed, when he made one comment too many, Kofi spoke. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but there was something beneath it that made Kwame's smile falter and his eyes widen just a fraction. Kofi simply stated that he was Amara's bodyguard, nothing more, but the way he said it carried a weight that transformed the words into something else entirely. It was a statement and a warning wrapped in silk, delivered with the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing to prove because he already knew his own worth. Kwame had laughed it off, made another dismissive comment, and walked away. But Amara had seen the moment of uncertainty in his eyes, the brief crack in his armor. She had turned to Kofi, intending to tell him that he didn't need to engage with men like Kwame, that she could handle her own battles. But before she could speak, he had said something that stopped her cold. He told her that Kwame had disrespected her, and that was not acceptable. Not a question, not a request for permission, simply a statement of fact, delivered with absolute certainty. And in that moment, Amara felt something shift inside her chest, a warmth spreading through her body that had nothing to do with the champagne or the heat of the crowded room. The evening had continued with speeches and shallow conversations and all the performative rituals of wealth and status, but Amara found she couldn't focus on any of it. She kept glancing at Kofi, who stood near the wall in his usual position, watching everything with an intensity that seemed to miss nothing. And then it happened, the moment that changed everything. A waiter approached with a tray of champagne, moving through the crowd with practiced efficiency, heading directly toward Amara. But Kofi moved faster. His hand shot out, stopping the waiter mid-step with such precision and authority that the man froze, confused and slightly frightened. Kofi stated simply that Amara hadn't ordered that drink, his tone leaving no room for argument. The waiter stammered that everyone was drinking champagne, that it was just a courtesy. But Kofi didn't move, didn't release the waiter's arm, didn't break eye contact. He said again that Amara hadn't ordered it, and this time there was something in his voice that made everyone nearby stop and turn. Amara frowned, about to tell Kofi he was overreacting, that it was just a drink. But Kofi picked up the glass, brought it to his nose, inhaled slowly, and then set it back down on the tray, with deliberate care. When he spoke, his words cut through the ambient noise of the gala like a blade. Someone had added something to the drink. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. Amara felt her blood turn to ice, her breath catching in her throat, her mind struggling to process what he had just said. Kofi's eyes scanned the crowd with laser focus, landing on a man near the exit, one of Kwame's known associates, a man whose face had gone pale as bone. The man turned and ran, pushing through the crowd, heading for the doors, and Kofi moved. One moment he was beside Amara, solid and still. The next moment he was across the room, covering 30 feet in what seemed like 3 seconds, his hand clamping down on the running man's shoulder with such force that the man cried out in pain and surprise. Kofi held him there, effortless and immovable, while security rushed over and the man protested loudly about assault and misunderstanding and how this was all a mistake. But Amara saw the truth in the man's eyes, the guilt and fear and panic of someone who had been caught. Security escorted the man out, while the gala erupted in whispers and speculation, everyone wanting to know what had just happened, who that bodyguard was, how he had moved so fast and known so quickly, what no one else had seen. Kofi returned to Amara's side, as if nothing had happened, his breathing steady, his expression calm, his suit not even wrinkled from the altercation. He asked if she was all right, his voice gentle with concern, his eyes searching her face for signs of shock or fear. But Amara couldn't speak. She could only stare at him, her mind racing with questions that multiplied faster than she could form them. How had he known? How had he moved like that? Who was this man she had hired? This man she had thought was simple and humble and ordinary. She managed to ask him how he knew about the drink, her voice barely above a whisper. He answered with the same maddening simplicity that he brought to everything. He paid attention. But Amara knew that wasn't an answer. Not really. No one paid attention like that. No one moved like that. No one had reflexes that fast, or instincts that sharp, or presence that commanding. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay in her bed in her penthouse apartment, staring at the ceiling, replaying the evening over and over in her mind. The speed of his movement, the precision of his action, the way every person in that room had seemed to shrink in Kofi's presence, as if they sensed something powerful and dangerous, even though he had done nothing threatening. Over the following weeks, strange incidents continued, each one more concerning than the last, and each time Kofi was there, anticipating danger before it arrived. Her car's brakes mysteriously failed during a scheduled maintenance check, but Kofi had already inspected the vehicle that morning and insisted she take his car instead, his instincts somehow warning him of sabotage before the mechanics discovered the cut brake lines. A fire broke out in her office building late one evening when she was working alone, but Kofi had pulled the alarm minutes before the flames spread. His explanation simple and unsatisfying. He had smelled smoke before anyone else. An intruder attempted to break into her penthouse at 3 a.m, bypassing 2 layers of security. But when the man climbed through the window, he found Kofi already waiting in the shadows, standing there in the darkness, as if he had known the exact moment and method of entry. Every time danger approached, Kofi was one step ahead. Every time disaster loomed, Kofi prevented it with such casual efficiency that it seemed almost supernatural. Thundi Wei cornered Amara one afternoon in her office, closing the door behind her and demanding answers with the bluntness of a friend who had earned the right to ask difficult questions. She wanted to know who Kofi really was, where he came from, what kind of training he had that made him move and think and act like some kind of shadow warrior from a movie. Amara had no answers to give her. She admitted with frustration and fascination warring in her voice that she didn't know anything about Kofi beyond the basics. She knew he came from the countryside, from some village he never named. She knew he was intelligent, observant, capable. But beyond that, he was a mystery wrapped in silence, a man who revealed nothing about himself, even as he became the most important presence in her daily life. Thandiwe shook her head, her expression torn between concern and something that looked almost like envy. She told Amara that if Kofi was this good at protecting her, imagine what else he was hiding, what other skills and secrets and dimensions of himself remained undiscovered. And that thought lodged in Amara's mind like a seed, growing and spreading until she couldn't ignore it any longer. That evening, after another long day of meetings and decisions and the endless performance of being a billionaire CEO, Amara confronted Kofi in her office. The city lights glowed beyond the windows, painting everything in shades of gold and shadow. She turned to face him where he stood, in his usual position, patient and still, and she demanded the truth, not a request, not a polite inquiry, a demand. She told him she needed to know who he really was, her voice rising with emotion she couldn't contain any longer. Kofi looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, his dark eyes reflecting the city lights, and something deeper, something that might have been pain or regret, or the burden of secrets too heavy to carry alone. He asked why it mattered, his voice soft but challenging. And that simple question broke something open inside Amara. She told him it mattered because she trusted him with her life, her voice cracking with raw honesty. She trusted him with everything that mattered to her, and yet she didn't even know his last name, didn't know where he came from, or why he was really there, or what he wanted from her. The vulnerability in her words seemed to affect Kofi in a way that nothing else had. His expression softened, the mask slipping just enough for her to see the man beneath the armor. He took a breath, and then he gave her what she asked for. His name was Kofi Mensah, he said quietly, and he came from a family she had probably heard of. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Mensah, the Mensah family. Amara felt her heart stop, felt the world tilt and reshape itself around this new information. Everyone in the country knew the Mensah name, even if most had never seen their faces or visited their estates or understood the true extent of their power and influence. The Mensah family was legendary. Old money so old, it predated the modern nation itself, a dynasty that had accumulated wealth and land and resources across generations through wisdom and strategy and the kind of long-term thinking that built empires. They owned mines that produced gold and diamonds, banks that financed half the country's major projects, vast stretches of land that fed thousands. But they lived in seclusion, far from the public eye, far from the media and the gossip and the social climbing that defined the lives of most wealthy families. Rumors surrounded them like morning mist. Stories passed from person to person about how they trained their sons in combat and strategy and leadership, preparing them from childhood to protect the family's legacy and navigate the dangerous waters of power and politics. People said the Mensah men were scholars and warriors both, educated in the finest institutions, but also trained in ancient arts of protection and warfare, carrying within them the accumulated wisdom of ancestors who had survived colonialism and war, and every challenge history had thrown at their line. And now Kofi was telling her that he was one of them, that the quiet man she had hired as her bodyguard was actually a hidden prince of one of Africa's most powerful families. Amara couldn't breathe. She stared at Kofi, seeing him again for the first time, understanding now why he moved the way he did, why people sensed something in him that they couldn't name, why he was always 3 steps ahead of every threat. But understanding brought more questions, not fewer. She asked him why he was there, why he had taken a position as her bodyguard, when he could have been anywhere, doing anything, living the privileged life his family name afforded. His answer changed everything. He told her that 3 months ago, he had been sent to evaluate her. His family had heard about her company, her rapid rise, her growing influence in sectors that touched on Mensa interests. They wanted to know if she was a threat, if she needed to be controlled or contained, or simply observed. So Kofi had come, had taken the position as her bodyguard to get close to her, to study her methods and motivations and character. Amara felt betrayed and violated, her trust shattered by the revelation that everything had been calculated, that she had been under surveillance by the very man she had come to rely on. She asked him bitterly if that was all she was to him, just an assignment, just a target to be evaluated and reported on. But Kofi stepped closer, his eyes locked on hers, with an intensity that made her breath catch, despite her anger. He told her that yes, he had come to evaluate her, but he had stayed for a different reason entirely. He stayed because within days of meeting her, he realized she was the most extraordinary woman he had ever encountered. He stayed because her strength wasn't born from privilege or inheritance or the easy path of those born into wealth, but from struggle and determination and a will that refused to break even when the world tried to crush her. He stayed because watching her navigate boardrooms full of men who underestimated her, watching her make decisions with courage and vision, watching her care for her employees and her community even as she built an empire, taught him what real power looked like. And he stayed because against all his training and every rule he had been raised to follow, he had fallen in love with her. The words hung in the air between them, simple and devastating. Amara felt tears burning in her eyes, felt her heart breaking and healing at the same time, felt the walls she had built around herself crumbling in the face of honesty so raw. It hurt to hear. She wanted to be angry. She wanted to throw him out, to tell him he had lied and betrayed her trust, and she never wanted to see him again. But she couldn't, because even through the hurt and confusion, she knew the truth. She had fallen for him too. It had happened slowly, imperceptibly, in moments she hadn't recognized as significant until now. The way he listened when she talked about her vision for the company. The way he asked questions that showed he understood not just what she was doing, but why it mattered. The way he stood beside her in silence, when words weren't needed. His presence alone, enough to steady her when the pressure of leadership became too heavy. The way he had protected her, not just physically, but emotionally, never judging her moments of doubt or fear, never using her vulnerability against her, the way so many people in her life had tried to do. She had fallen for the quiet strength in him, the integrity that ran so deep, it informed every action, the sense that here was a man who could stand beside her as an equal, who didn't need to diminish her to feel strong himself. But before she could find the words to tell him any of this, her phone rang, shattering the moment with the harsh intrusion of the outside world. It was her head of security, his voice tight with urgency, telling her about an emergency board meeting that Kwame Otto had called for the next morning. Kwame was claiming that Amara had engaged in illegal business practices, and he had evidence, fabricated but convincing enough, to sway board members who had always been uncomfortable with a woman from humble origins holding so much power. If Kwame succeeded, if the board voted against her, she would lose control of the company she had built from nothing, the company that represented every sacrifice she had ever made, every dream she had ever dared to dream. Amara hung up the phone, her hands shaking, her mind racing through possibilities and strategies and the sickening realization that Kwame had been planning this for months, that all the threats and sabotage had been leading to this moment. She felt Kofi beside her before she saw him move, his presence solid and grounding. He asked what happened, and she told him everything, her voice breaking, as she described the trap that had been laid, the lies that had been crafted, the evidence that had been manufactured to destroy her. She asked him what she should do, admitting her fear for the first time since he had known her, allowing him to see the terrified girl beneath the confident billionaire. Kofi took her hands in his, and when he spoke, his voice carried absolute certainty. He promised her that she wasn't going to lose anything, not the company, not her reputation, not her future. Amara asked how he could promise such a thing when the odds were stacked against her, when Kwame had been planning this assault for so long. Kofi's answer was simple and fierce, because he wasn't going to let Kwame win. That night, Amara barely slept, her mind churning with anxiety and hope, and the strange comfort of knowing that Kofi was somewhere in her apartment, watching over her even in the darkness. Morning came too quickly, bringing with it the board meeting that would decide her fate. The boardroom was packed when she arrived, filled with shareholders and lawyers and journalists who smelled blood in the water and wanted to witness the fall of the young billionaire who had risen too high too fast. Kwame sat at the head of the table, looking smug and satisfied, dressed in an expensive suit that proclaimed his victory before the meeting even began. Amara entered with her head high, refusing to show fear or uncertainty, and Kofi walked beside her, not behind her as usual, but beside her, his presence making a statement that everyone in the room noticed. Whispers rippled through the crowd, people asking each other who the man with her was, and why she had brought what appeared to be muscle to a board meeting. Kwame made a show of greeting Amara with false politeness, his eyes sliding to Kofi with barely concealed contempt, asking if she had brought security, because she expected the meeting to turn violent. Amara ignored the provocation and took her seat, Kofi standing behind her right shoulder, his hands clasped in front of him, his expression neutral, but his eyes taking in every person in the room, reading faces and body language, and the invisible currents of power and allegiance that flowed beneath the surface. Kwame began his presentation, and it was masterful in its deception. He showed documents that appeared authentic, financial records that seemed damning, contracts that suggested corruption, emails that painted Amara as greedy and unethical and willing to break laws for profit. He spoke eloquently about the responsibility of the board to protect shareholders, about the need for integrity and leadership, about the painful necessity of removing someone who had betrayed the trust placed in them. Some board members nodded along, convinced by the performance. Others looked uncertain, wanting to believe in Amara, but struggling against the weight of evidence that Kwame had so carefully constructed. When he finished, the room fell into heavy silence, broken only by the sound of papers rustling and people shifting in their seats. The board chair, a woman named Amma, who had been in business longer than most people in the room had been alive, looked at Amara with eyes that missed nothing, had seen every trick and scheme and manipulation that power could devise. She asked Amara if she had anything to say in her defense, her voice neutral, giving nothing away, about her own thoughts or inclinations. Amara stood, and for a moment her mind went blank with fear and the crushing weight of everything she stood to lose. But then she felt Kofi's presence behind her, steady and sure, and she found her voice. She told the room that everything Kwame had shown them was a lie, and she could prove it. Her voice was calm, controlled, carrying the authority of truth rather than the desperation of denial. Kwame laughed, the sound sharp and mocking in the silent room. He asked what proof she could possibly have, what excuses she thought would save her now. Amara didn't answer him. Instead, she nodded to Kofi. He stepped forward, moving with the same fluid grace that had become familiar to her, but seemed to surprise everyone else in the room, and he placed a tablet on the table in front of the board chair. When Kofi spoke, his voice commanded the room in a way that silenced even the whispers, his tone carrying authority that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with the certainty of a man who knew his own power. He explained that for the past 3 months, he had been investigating the threats against Amara, tracking the source of the sabotage, following the money and the communications, and the careful trail of evidence that people like Kwame always left behind, no matter how clever they thought they were. What he had found was a conspiracy orchestrated by Kwame to destroy Amara's company so that he and his foreign partners could acquire it at a fraction of its value, expanding their own empire on the ruins of what she had built. Kofi tapped the tablet screen, and documents appeared, projected onto the wall for everyone to see. Emails between Kwame and foreign investors discussing strategies to undermine Amara's reputation. Phone records showing calls made at strategic times before each sabotage attempt. Bank transfers revealing payments made to the people who had cut brake lines and started fires and attempted break-ins. Every piece of evidence meticulously gathered, verified, time-stamped, irrefutable. The room erupted in shock and anger, board members shouting questions, lawyers demanding to examine the documents, journalists furiously taking notes as the story unfolded before them. Kwame's face had gone white, his carefully constructed confidence crumbling, as he realized that his entire scheme had been exposed, that the trap he had set for Amara had caught him instead. He stood, his voice rising in desperate protest, demanding to know who this man was, who dared to make such accusations, why anyone should believe him, what authority he had to investigate anything. But his words sounded hollow, even to his own ears, the panic evident beneath the bluster. Amma raised her hand, and the room fell silent instantly, her authority requiring no explanation or enforcement. She looked at Kofi with sharp, intelligent eyes, studying him with the same intensity he had been using to study everyone else. She asked who he was, her tone making it clear that she wanted more than just a name, that she sensed something significant about this man who had just dismantled Kwame's conspiracy with calm efficiency. Kofi met her gaze without hesitation, without any of the deference or nervousness that most people showed in the presence of someone with Amma's reputation and power. He told her his name was Kofi Mensah, and in those 2 words, he changed the entire dynamic of the room. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of someone's sharp intake of breath. Every person in that boardroom knew the Mensah name, understood what it meant, recognized the weight of power and legacy it carried. Amma's eyes widened just slightly, the first sign of genuine surprise Amara had ever seen from the usually unflappable woman. She repeated the name as a question, seeking confirmation, asking if Kofi meant he was from the Mensah family, the legendary dynasty that controlled so much of the country's wealth and resources. Kofi confirmed it with a simple yes, offering no elaboration, no justification, just the bare fact, stated with quiet dignity. The room exploded in whispers and speculation, people turning to each other to confirm what they had just heard, trying to understand why someone from the Mensa family would be working as a bodyguard, what this revelation meant for the power dynamics in the room, what consequences would follow from the exposure of Kwame's crimes against someone the Mensas had apparently chosen to protect. Kwame looked like he might collapse, his face going from white to gray, his hands gripping the table edge as if it was the only thing keeping him upright. He had thought he was destroying a self-made billionaire with no powerful connections, someone he could crush without consequence. Instead, he had attacked someone under the protection of one of the country's most powerful families. Kofi continued speaking, his voice cutting through the chaos with calm authority, explaining that Amara was completely innocent of all charges, that she had built her company through legitimate means and ethical practices, that her only crime in Kwame's eyes was being too successful too quickly and threatening his own position in the market. He presented more evidence, showing how Kwame had been working with foreign investors who wanted to exploit the country's resources, how he had been willing to destroy an African-owned company to serve outside interests, how his actions betrayed not just Amara, but everyone in the room who believed in supporting homegrown businesses and entrepreneurs. The evidence was damning and comprehensive, leaving no room for doubt or alternative interpretation. Ama's expression had shifted from surprise to cold anger as she absorbed the full scope of Kwame's betrayal. She turned to the board members, her voice carrying the weight of decades of experience and the moral authority of someone who had always put integrity above profit. She asked for a vote to remove Kwame from the board immediately and refer his actions to the authorities for criminal investigation. Every hand in the room went up without hesitation. The vote unanimous, swift, and final. Kwame tried to speak, tried to protest, tried to salvage something from the wreckage of his scheme. But no one was listening anymore. He stood there, isolated and exposed, his reputation destroyed, his plans ruined, his future reduced to legal battles and the certainty of consequences. He turned his rage on Amara, his face twisting with hatred, as he told her this wasn't over, that she shouldn't think she had won just because she had someone powerful protecting her, that he would find a way to make her pay for humiliating him. But before Amara could respond, Kofi stepped forward, and there was something in his movement that made everyone in the room instinctively lean back, made Kwame's words die in his throat. Kofi's voice was quiet when he spoke, almost gentle, but it carried a promise that was absolute and unshakable. He told Kwame that as long as he drew breath, Amara would never face him or anyone like him alone, that any threat to her was a threat to the Mensa family, and that Kwame should consider very carefully whether he wanted to continue down that path. The implicit threat was clear, not of violence, but of consequences far beyond what Kwame could survive. Kwame fled from the room, his exit lacking any of the dignity or grace he had possessed when he arrived. The board members erupted in applause, some standing to congratulate Amara on her vindication, others gathering around to examine the evidence more closely, all of them relieved that crisis had been averted and justice had prevailed. Ama approached Amara after the meeting cleared, her stern expression softening into something that might have been approval or respect or recognition of a kindred spirit. She told Amara that she had built something extraordinary, something that went beyond profit and market share, to represent hope and possibility for everyone who had ever dreamed of rising above their circumstances. She advised Amara to never let anyone take that away from her, to guard her vision as fiercely as she had guarded her integrity, to remember that success built on truth would always outlast success built on deception. Amara could only nod, too overwhelmed with emotion to trust her voice. After everyone left, after the lawyers and journalists and board members filed out, discussing what they had witnessed, Amara and Kofi stood alone in the empty boardroom, surrounded by the detritus of battle, papers scattered across the table, the tablet still displaying evidence of Kwame's conspiracy. Amara turned to Kofi, tears streaming down her face, and told him he didn't have to do that, didn't have to reveal his identity, didn't have to expose himself to protect her. But Kofi's response was simple and devastating in its honesty. He told her yes, he did have to do it, because she was worth fighting for, worth revealing himself for, worth everything he had given and more. Amara asked why, her voice breaking on the single word. Why he cared so much, why he had risked so much, why he had chosen her. Kofi stepped closer, his eyes soft with emotion. He no longer tried to hide, and he told her that she didn't need to thank him, didn't need to find words for what he had done. All he wanted was permission to stay, to remain by her side, not as her bodyguard, but as her partner, her protector, her equal, her love. And Amara, who had spent her entire adult life building walls around her heart, who had learned to trust no one completely, who had survived by being self-sufficient and independent, let those walls crumble completely. She said yes through her tears, yes to partnership, yes to trust, yes to the terrifying and exhilarating vulnerability of letting someone truly know her. In the weeks that followed, Kofi brought her to his family's estate, hidden in the mountains far from the city, a sprawling compound of stone buildings and gardens that seemed to exist outside of time. His family welcomed her with warmth that surprised her, his mother embracing her like a daughter, his father nodding with respect for what she had accomplished. They held a ceremony under the stars, not a wedding, but a blessing, a recognition of the bond between Amara and Kofi that went deeper than law or convention. Amara's company thrived in the months that followed, expanding into new markets and launching innovations that transformed industries and created thousands of jobs. With the Mensah family's resources and her vision combined, she became not just a billionaire, but a symbol of what was possible when talent met opportunity, when integrity met power, when the new generation built on the wisdom of the old, without being constrained by its limitations. Kwame was arrested, his co-conspirators exposed, his empire dismantled piece by piece, as investigators uncovered the full extent of his corruption. But Amara took no joy in his downfall, felt no satisfaction in his suffering. She had learned that true success wasn't measured by the defeat of enemies, but by the building of something positive, something lasting, something that made the world better than she found it. Her relationship with Kofi deepened with each passing day, built on honesty and mutual respect, and the kind of partnership that made both of them stronger than they could ever be alone. He taught her things about herself she hadn't known, showed her that accepting help wasn't weakness but wisdom, that vulnerability could be strength when shared with the right person. And she taught him things too, about the world beyond his family's estate, about the struggles of ordinary people trying to build extraordinary lives, about the responsibility that came with power and the importance of using privilege to lift others rather than simply protecting what you already had. Together they created something new, something that transcended the boundaries of business and family legacy and individual achievement. They established foundations that funded education in rural villages, giving children like Amara once was the chance to pursue dreams that seemed impossible from where they started. They invested in young entrepreneurs, providing not just capital, but mentorship and connections, and the kind of support that could turn potential into reality. They built schools and hospitals and community centers in places that had been forgotten by those with power, bringing resources and opportunity to people who had been told they didn't matter. Everywhere they went, people saw them not as billionaires, playing at philanthropy, but as genuine partners in the struggle for a better future. Two people who understood both the heights of success and the depths of struggle, who had walked both paths and chose to build bridges between them. 1 year after they first met, Kofi proposed to Amara, not in a grand ballroom or luxury restaurant, but on the red earth of her childhood village, under the same sun that had watched her grow, from a girl selling vegetables with her mother, to a woman who commanded boardrooms and building empires. He knelt in the dust, wearing simple clothes, his expensive suits left behind in the city, and he asked her to marry him with words that were simple and profound. He told her she was the strongest, most extraordinary woman he had ever known, that she had taught him what courage really meant, that he wanted to spend the rest of his life standing beside her as she continued to change the world. The wedding was a celebration that blended tradition and modernity, village and city, past and future, into something entirely their own. Drums echoed alongside violins, kente cloth mixed with silk, village elders shared space with city dignitaries, and everyone who attended understood they were witnessing something rare and precious, a love story that proved fairy tales could exist in the real world if you were brave enough to believe in them and strong enough to fight for them. As Amara and Kofi exchanged vows under a sky that seemed to glow brighter in celebration, as they promised to honor and challenge and support each other through whatever came next, Amara thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She thought about the girl she had been, scared and determined, dreaming of escaping poverty, but not yet understanding what she was really searching for. She thought about the woman she had become, powerful and wealthy, but also lonely, building walls to protect herself that had also imprisoned her. And she thought about Kofi, the man who had walked into her life, disguised as something simple, but carrying within him depths she was still discovering. The hidden master who had taught her that the greatest strength wasn't in standing alone, but in choosing the right person to stand beside. In the end, she learned that love built on truth is the greatest treasure of all, worth more than all the money in all the banks, more valuable than all the companies and properties and material success that the world could offer. If this story touched your heart, remember it, share it. Let it remind you that goodness still wins, that love still conquers, and that your own story, whatever it may be, is still being written with every choice you make and every person you allow into your heart.